another episode of the Best Book Club. I'm your host, Anu Fatora, and this is the podcast where I discuss the best stories with the best minds in the community. On this episode, I'll be discussing Blood Money by Nicely Done. With me, I have Hans Gutherson. Thank you for joining me.
So great to be back talking about Blood Money. I've many times said it was my favorite story. This is very exciting.
Well, it's kind of interesting because I remember when I was re-listening to the favorites episode, you said "Luckily Unlucky" is your favorite. So it's interesting that your favorites do seem to shift around a little bit, like what your top
It's
one
true.
is.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. And I guess that's true for everyone. As we grow, the things we like and the reasons we like them for changes. And I think we can definitely talk about that with this story because reading through it as I was doing again, I understood why young me thought it was the best, and in many of the lists I've posted and many of the talks I've done, I've mentioned it as my top all time. But then I'll read something else from back in the day, like Luckily Unlucky, and it might be fresher in my mind. I'll go, yeah, no, that's my favorite. It's definitely easily at any time. I think remains even reading through it, and I wasn't sure like because it's been a bit since I fully read through it if it would hold up. But I'd say definitely still for a lot of reasons. It's one of my all times, and I think everyone should read it.
Yes, I agree. It's an interesting read, a very kind of a I'd say like a postmark of the time period.
Interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, there's plenty here to dive into, but to start with, it was posted first on April 22nd, 2013, and as of now, it has just over 15,000 views.
Mm.
I'm curious if that has any bearing on your feeling about it, like if it's some kind of classic or under like cult classic or um, like a hidden gem.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I suppose definitely like whenever I see that, I think of how underrated it is. And like when I mention Blood Money, obviously the people on like DeviantArt or elsewhere, they have no clue what I'm talking about, like many of the LF exclusive stories. And as you pointed out, nicely done, who's also on DeviantArt, has very few stories on there. He's blown up
Mm-hmm.
after I did a Q&A with him, he started posting art on DeviantArt and blew up there with a big audience and made a nice piece for Teacher Wedgie Fight My Story. He's I love nicely done. But yeah, it's weird like it's so underrated and all the comments obviously on that story are super acclaim. Everyone loves it. So it's unfortunate that it doesn't have more love, I think makes it this hidden gem I think as you described it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not one that most people would think about normally. And
Yeah.
even before I reread it after so long, whenever I would think back on Nicely Done's work, Feeling the Fire Until It Burns always comes to mind before Blood Money. So,
Yeah, do you
uh,
remember if that one had like a lot more views or something? Do you remember?
it doesn't have, I actually have the stats. It
Let me
has
hear.
less views, actually. It's just over
Interesting.
10,000.
Yeah,
But yeah,
it's
it's
interesting to think that like yeah in general their stories despite in my mind I think we'll get into this having a lot going for them that many stories don't. They don't have the views, and I think that's probably something we might chat about. And I think what you've known about and been interested in general. I think, uh,
definitely.
but yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting.
Yeah, I guess to keep the point brief before we actually dive into
Mm.
the story, I think the amount of views is sort of an indication on maybe at the time, uh, maybe not now, but perhaps at the time, the interest that people had. Um,
Yeah.
because I guess to define Nicely Done's work in writing, it's intelligent. Um,
Mm.
and I do want to go into that further later on, but for now, I'd like to give a summary. So especially because this is a story that so many people are unaware of. So, this story follows a girl's exploration into a new world guided by her sister, during which their tutor is dragged into the madness. And despite all of the wild things that happen and everything that's going on with it, it really is just that one sentence. That is exactly what's happening, which is kind of
Sure.
crazy to think about.
Yeah.
So much happens based off of a simple idea.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an excellent summary. I don't have like a pithy one like I did for Sore Winner to
Hmm.
sum it up any better than that beyond like trio wedgie happiness, but um yeah, you're right. It's funny to think like, and it's interesting because there's a lot that like we don't see but it feels like we're aware of, like their world outside of what I always pictured as a very gothic mansion. And I'm getting jumping ahead a bit, I think, but the story feels very gothic to me, and I think that's one of the reasons I gravitated so much towards it, and still do, because it really has that tone of being gothic without being like a scary story, which is very rare in the community, I think,
Hmm.
to fill that sort of space, I guess.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you bring up of there's so many things that's set nicely done apart from basically every other writer in this community, but that is one that I haven't really thought about, but it does kind of ring true. I guess it kind of feeds
Yeah.
into the themes and ideas that he explores, are maybe not entirely different from others, but they are so much more realized and fleshed out.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, it's that intelligence that you noted in the beginning that
Hmm.
it really drew me to the story when I read this, because as you noted, 2012, early days of the forums for me, especially like when I was joining,
2013.
and early 2013. Sorry,
Hmm.
thank you. Yeah, early days in the forum. Still, a couple of years since the first stories are even posted back in like 2011, and I'm new to it. So I'm seeing something so intelligent, something that deep dives into a lot of different themes, like identity, like is something I'm interested in, but also pleasure and what that means, and coming of age in some ways, and relationships, but even stuff that's like kind of hinted at freedom, and like really deep stuff that kind of dances around. It's and the relationships between sisters and power dynamics. It's like it's so much to look at in some ways. So reading it, there's just a lot to take in, and you're like, wow, not only are these wedgies super detailed and creatively described, like I'm getting a lot of cool insights about life, and I'm learning something. It's in really creative, like poetic ways. So I think that's a lot that really sets it apart, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think that's a mark of the greatest works, in writing and in media in general, is if it challenges you and it makes you think about things in a different way,
Mm, yeah,
which that seems to be the case for all of Nicely Done's work.
yeah,
So
I think
you've,
so.
yeah, uh, so you've hinted at this. You brought it up a little bit. Do you remember how you felt when you first read this story and like, why you went to it in the first place? What drew you into it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So April 2013, like you mentioned, it's I was obviously reading every single post on the site and commenting incessantly on everything. And I'm like one of the first people to comment on this story, which is nice. And I comment throughout because I was in love with it instantly. Um, because I it instantly jumped out to me as like this very interesting setting. It has, of course, the psychologically pleasing three, the number three, three characters. That's I love. I love trios and stories, and I think we generally all do as human beings because three is so naturally psychologically just like satisfying. Um, and I won't list all the examples, but I can if that's necessary. But so when I see
Well, a
three
couple of them.
characters right away, so it's very obvious. Like three strikes, you're out. Beginning, middle, and end
Hmm.
trilogy. Like this, three is everywhere, and it's something that I think to us as human beings, it sticks with us. Um, so when I see like a trio of characters, I love it. I think the reason why WNR is three characters is it comes back to Blood Money and like how you can have these three different perspectives. Um, and why I've always like gravitated towards stories that focus on three different perspectives. And I feel like that's where a lot of it comes from. It's because Nicely Done did it so well with three very interesting, very different characters. So almost in like almost too different. Like it's the classic, oh, these sisters, one's one way and one's the exact opposite. There's no like middle ground, you know? And we see that with Casey and Elizabeth, certainly. And Charlene fits in this nice middle ground between them, and that's obviously deliberate, and I'm sure we'll get into all that. But yeah, when I read that and I see all this instantly, the really cool three dynamic, the intelligence behind some of it, like Casey's analytical nature, like that, because I've was reading stories like sadistic, and I love the hyper realism and that deep, like what is a fetishist's mind like, and how are they calculating and putting themselves in power. So this feels like an evolution of that sort of school. So seeing all that, I was right away like, I'm hooked. I gotta keep in with this story, and I'm so glad it's one of the few that's finished. I think that
Hmm.
also is a reason it holds a special place in my heart because it's finished. So that's
Yeah.
always gonna put it a step above other stories in my mind.
Yeah. And a small example of another three is there's three syllables in the title, Blood Money.
That's very good. I love that. Three is so psychologically satisfying. I threw out a
Yeah.
few, but I know there's countless others. Like,
And
I,
nicely
I think
done.
even
Three
nicely
syllables.
done. Again, three syllables. So like subconsciously, I imagine some of that,
Uh-huh.
But it goes on and on.
Yeah.
So I always love three characters. And people always say like, "Oh, how many characters should I have in a story?" And like, "How should I do this?" I'm always like, three. Three is the magic number. Like, it's just the way to do it.
Hmm.
Um, so I love how like you get this really cool trio. Because I mean, a lot of stories, interestingly too, to I guess vaguely generalize, so many of the stories on Lucky Fish forums, I would argue and warrant, are about two characters. There's a lot of duos, and that makes it good to explore relationships or friendships and things. But where three characters are main and central, I feel like that's not done as much. Pretty sure if we went through, we would not find many examples of that.
Yeah, I agree. There's a fascination on duos. I mean,
Yeah,
Sore Winner, Luckily Unlucky, Two Worlds, My Own Story, Lucy
yeah,
and Daniela.
yeah. Great
Uh,
examples.
yeah.
It's true. It's true. And I think because fundamentally, wedgies revolve around the giver receiver relationship.
Yes.
There's not a third player in that dynamic usually. And there doesn't really need to be. You can have the watcher, which I guess Charlene in some ways is. She plays this observer role, and obviously JCCW takes it a step further with a story three wedgie perspectives where literally the third perspective is someone watching the wedgie and just kind of seeing it happen. So that feels like a natural third. But it really, and that, obviously you can have group wedgies and other people giving them, but so many of the stories we read only require two people, two stories, the giver, receiver, and if that role switches, it's still just two people. Um, so it's really cool to see like a third person, and it's too bad in Blood Money we don't have like more full out crazy three girl wedgie scenes happening where they're all going at it. We don't really get that, sadly.
Hmm. Yeah, it's we're gonna keep diving into the points you brought up in varying degrees. I guess to really bring it into the actual story now is I'm going into it, like rereading it for the first time in years, I was pretty disappointed that Nicely Done used the
Mm.
story title within the first paragraph instead of letting readers think on why he chose it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's something I always love, and I talked
Yeah.
about it to some extent when we discussed, I believe, Sir Winner, on like
Yes. Yeah.
electronic music, and like I really like a title not being used, and you have to sort of pull from what's given to you the actual meaning of the title in relation to the story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny because like you might have to break it down for me. Like at the end of the story, they have this very beautiful ending, and you know that ending I love. I think it's one of the best endings. But when we start the story, Charlene is talking about how she like learns to tolerate the job and hates it. It feels like and she's calling it. She's like it's blood money taking the to doing the job, which I
Hmm.
don't fully get
Yeah.
because we don't really know like where the money's coming from, so it's not literal blood money, I guess. But like my question, I guess, to you is like, what at what point is Charlene telling us this beginning? You know what I mean? Like, is this after she's been in the job for a bit, but before the ending? Because she's telling us back this story, or like after the ending, does something happen and she hates the job, and now she's telling us about how hated the job or something.
What do you mean? What do you I guess what do you I'm not quite sure what you're asking.
So you know how the story starts and Charlene's telling us it was just a job, right?
Yeah.
At at what point is she like telling this story to someone?
Oh. Hmm.
Like she's narrating. Like at what point do you feel like that happens? Because she's telling us how much she hated the job, but by the end she's really in love with it. So like, has she just started, or like, do you feel like maybe her telling this story, this first part, is to hint like things did not end as well as maybe the story ended? It's probably not that complicated. Maybe she just had this meeting and now she's telling the story, but I wanted your input on that, what
Hmm.
you thought. Something I never thought of before.
Yeah, I honestly never thought of it as Charlene relaying the story of what happened after the fact. I always saw it as that little bit of her describing her feelings about the job and calling it blood money and all that was always more of just an internal monologue, um, as sort of setting the scene, and then the rest of the story is her going through it, um, while we're reading it.
Interesting. Yeah, and then okay, so then I suppose her shift from calling Casey like a devil who gave her a lot of misery is just over time she sort of falls into this relationship with her, and
Yeah,
she's laying that out for us, I suppose. Okay, yeah, that's how
yeah.
I usually interpreted it. It's just as I was
Hmm.
looking over the intro, that was throwing me off. It's like, but wait a minute, you're telling us a story and you seem to really hate Casey and the job, but like at what point are you telling us this?
Well, I don't. It didn't seem like Charlene ever actually hated Casey. It was like she got a weird feeling from Elizabeth, but
Mm,
she liked Casey because she was so studious, and
yeah,
she was reading Casey's body language and seeing that she was so interested and invested in what was happening.
yeah.
Hmm. Well, I
I
mean, with
like the beginning too, though. That like we set up a bit about Charlene with like the
hmm
mother who's yelling at her through doors and asking her if she met boys, and like we never see her again. The whole interesting where the parents question of wedgie fetish fiction, and I guess probably teen fiction in general we take from that. Um, yeah, but it's just a fun, interesting start when she mentions like she sets up the story as this very like, oh, I had pain and I had awkward happenings and misery. And it's because of one person who was a devil, and then the story like never really sort of foreshadows, I think, in the same way some of that like bad stuff's gonna happen.
hmm.
So that's interesting.
Yeah, I with the introduction, really, I think Nicely Done really shows off his chops here.
Mm,
He gives the readers just the right amount of detail to get an understanding and idea without revealing everything. I think it's a fantastic hook.
yeah,
Something else I was that I really liked was is the idea of swapping between perspectives. Um,
yeah,
it gives the feel of a legitimate novel, and I'm very glad that
yeah.
he decided to indicate which perspective is being highlighted before the part
Mm,
starts. Because
yeah,
I've read many books, and the one of the ones that comes to mind is the First Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, where that happens,
hmm,
especially in the Illyarith War, the second book in that trilogy, where the perspectives swap. But there are so many where there's a group of protagonists essentially, um,
yeah.
and it swaps between them. So I think it gives that sort of novel feel.
Definitely. Yeah. And that's partly when I mentioned like it feels like a very gothic story. Like when I read this, I always felt and whenever I go back to it, I feel the same way. It's good enough to be published. Like it could be a novel you pick off the shelf called Blood Money and you read it. It's of that high a quality that you could sell it in the stores and I would buy it and I feel like it would do well. Wedgies or no, it's just the intelligence of it, the, as you mentioned, masterful way he sort of moves between perspectives, making them all feel very unique. I feel like is one of the best examples of doing that ever.
hmm And I want to bring this up before we get too far into the discussion. Somehow, even in this masterwork, underage content worms its way in during
Always,
Elizabeth's
yeah,
recollection of growing up and growing apart from her sister. It's
yeah,
somehow it always works its way. That underage always sneaks its little tentacles in, and
yeah.
somehow. So just yet another uh, call out to the community. It's not okay. Don't put that stuff in there.
Of course, never okay. Yeah, and we have to acknowledge it, and I'm glad you
Exactly.
do.
Yes, especially in these stories that are so highly regarded and held in such high esteem. I think it's even more
Yeah,
important. Um,
yeah.
I was unsure about it when I first went through it, but actually after getting through the thing that I'm about to bring up, I think I had my mind made up on it.
Mm.
There's just something about an older sister doing things to a younger one without their consent that creeps me out. Yeah, I feel like I'm allowing the acts to continue by reading. And I
Mm.
have a passage that explicitly states, Nicely Done knows what he's doing and leans into
Yeah,
it. Here we go,
interesting.
Casey. Get ready. I'm about to make your panties rub you in really dirty places. How does that make you feel, knowing that your sister is doing such things to you? Why do you think Nicely Done leans so hard into a tone of discomfort for readers?
That's a great question. I feel like it's partly that gothic sentiment. This whole idea that this story could be like a Wuthering Heights, which I've never read, or something like Castle of Otranto, which I have read, one like the earliest gothic novel. The ones that are typified by like the creepy gothic mansions and the creepy atmospheres and like the gargoyles watching. Honestly, it feels very like in that, and a big marker of those types of stories and what is gothic is what is unsettling and that goes in areas other stories don't. And I think you're exactly right that he's playing into that sort of sisterly dynamic. It's almost incestuous in some ways, especially if we look at Wedgies through that very sexual lens and we say he's doing a sexual act to her. Is that not a form of like soft incest in some ways? And I feel like some of the commenters, right, note the rapey aspects
Yes.
that are kind of going on, because it's without consent, as you said. It's very brutal stuff. She's getting hung, she's getting her panties ripped and stuff. Very, very brutal wedgies that are
hmm
happening. So I think he knows it's going to make a lot of readers uncomfortable. and he's playing into that. He's saying, how far can I push that? Can I get the readers outside of their comfort zone? Can I expose them to something they might not think about or want to read necessarily, to sort of match with the setting, but also like it's not comfortable for the characters. So if I can instill that in readers and make that uncomfortable, that feels like a great achievement in my mind. If you can pull that off in your readers and have them sort of feeling in some way what the characters are, to really put them in that world. So I imagine that's a big part of doing that. And it's really cool of you to point it out.
Yeah, yeah. Jack538 is one of the ones who brought it up most often about the sort of
Mm,
incestual feel. Um, yeah, it's it, going back to the sort of the best of the best challenging you. Um, it's this story absolutely brings it confronts you with something that people don't normally think about, um,
yeah.
and it I think it in some ways challenges your conceptions of what's okay between sisters and how far you can go.
Yeah. And what's okay and with wedgies and wedgie stories. How
Hmm.
far can you go with a wedgie, and how far is too far, and what happens when you cross lines. In this story, people seem okay when lines are crossed. There's no real like consequences to the actions, and there's a very happy ending, but realistically, it probably wouldn't go that well.
Yeah.
There'd probably be some punching, and there'd probably be a lack of wedgies after somebody crossed the line the first time, but
Hmm.
we like it for that fantastical nature part of it.
Yeah, and it's delivered so well
Mm,
that you don't really question it. You just go along with it.
yeah.
The line "She was always taller than me" that Casey thinks during their first session reads so deeply to me. I can see the
Mm,
superficial level of Elizabeth being physically taller than Casey, but I read that line as Casey's view of Elizabeth as a whole, speaking on not just her physical stature, but also her personality being bigger, always feeling like she's dominated by Elizabeth one way or another, like Casey's
yeah.
shadow of Elizabeth. I think in
Mm-hmm.
some ways it's a reflection of Casey's self image.
I like that. There's a lot that's like really clever and really beautiful. Obviously, I mentioned that there's something poetic about a lot of the language, sayings like "evil eyes of delight" or
Hmm.
shattering my strange lust. Like it's really beautiful language, and part of the reason I feel like it's novelistic and novelesque in a lot of ways. And there, I feel like there is such a great attention to detail there. So pulling out lines like that and analyzing them like is definitely warranted. It's even interesting how in the beginning, uh, Elizabeth is like, "Call me Eliza," and then Charlene does. And
Hmm.
she calls her later on. She calls her Eliza a bunch in her monologuing and her narration. And I thought that was such a nice little touch too. It's like these characters are dynamic. They're changing. They feel real. This is how someone would actually write a diary or be retelling a story, and it's not like something superficial or feels rushed in any ways. So yeah, it's great to see you pull on lines like that, and even how he continually uses metaphors. There's ones that I guess are expanded throughout the entire story. This idea of an angel and devil
Hmm.
that's span all the way from the first sentences to right into the ending of it, and obviously that symbology, which I think again is like really well handled, and obviously it's a bit familiar, but it works really well. I think throughout, because we don't see writers sort of take that poetic an approach to a wedgie story usually.
Yeah, you could really describe not just Blood Money, but all of Nicely Done's works as him painting a he's painting art as opposed to writing stories.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Yeah.
Something else that I picked up on is the motif of Casey's back. It's very interesting to me, as though
Mm,
Nicely Done is trying to convey her personality through the inflexibility of her back. You
hmm.
know,
Interesting.
she's discovered what she enjoys by the start of the story, reading classic literature, having intelligent conversation, and she wants to stick to it, due in part to the perception she has of superficiality from her peers. And it's it becomes an extremely muddy and unclear question of, is Elizabeth actually helping Casey when you take those into account?
Mm, yep. Yeah. I always thought that was such an interesting dynamic. When you get to the end of the story and it's kind of revealed, quote unquote, that she's been pushing her sister to open up and get into this relationship with Charlene, it puts a new sort of spin on things, which is also a bit unique. But I love how you use the word inflexible, because we can even just poke at that and say her sister, Elizabeth's sister, was inflexible, and she's trying to make her flexible. She's trying to have her bend so she doesn't break, so she changes. And I think that's a really interesting point in like how characters do things and motivations are pointed at in very subtle ways, including mentioning a motif of like their back, for example.
Hmm.
I think is interesting. And there's things that are more obvious, like Elizabeth's coldness when she describes herself in the beginning of like, oh yeah, I'm cold, and but she clearly cares a lot about her sister in some ways, but it's not super like obvious
Yeah.
because of how she treats her.
Yeah.
But so you kind of you could argue as a reader like, is that ending earned? Maybe, which isn't something I thought much about throughout the years, but something you could probably pick at and say like, is she really like helping her sister, or is this just like a lucky byproduct of her treatment? And just Casey more on her own? Is she more like doing this shift and changing on her own, or is it really Elizabeth doing this sort of Mary Sue esque push to get her sister to change? Which is interesting. I love that it opens up all these questions.
Yeah. And I think it brings into the question: do the ends justify the means?
Yeah,
Because we find out that
right.
it's supposed to be that Elizabeth is just trying to get Casey to be open and,
Yeah.
well, to try new things, and be
Yep.
open about herself. But the way she goes about it is abhorrent to me. So I don't.
Mm.
It's another tough question.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's
Yeah.
I can't I don't know if I can really say one way or the other if what she did
I
is
like that.
okay because of what she was trying to accomplish.
It's a great point. Yeah, and it's so, it's funny because if we look at it like trying to put a realistic lens on it, it's like, why doesn't she just talk to her sister, tell her to open up? Like Elizabeth seems well adjusted. She could help her sister. Nope, she's got to wedgie her brutally and hope that gets her to where she needs to be in very incestuous ways. So it's a very interesting question. I mean, nicely done clearly has like is not afraid from being very direct with the sexuality in his stories and in his art. It's not this sort of dancing around it or using the sex for like anything less than like being a very sexual thing. What I'm trying to say is like the wedgies are always very sexual, and it's never a case of like, oh, it's friendly pulls between sisters. Like clearly there's a very sexual motive behind all of this, so it really does muddy the waters, as you pointed out, and that's an apt descriptor.
Yeah. I don't think just a sit down conversation between the two of them would work out,
Hmm.
even
Yeah,
in
it's
the real
true.
life, because of
Yeah.
how their dynamic is described as having changed from when they were younger.
Yeah,
Because
it's a
Casey
good
has grown
point.
apart. But
Yeah.
there's got to be there must be some other way that she could have gone
Some
about
middle
doing
ground.
this.
Yeah, some
Yeah.
middle ground. Yeah, it would be a
Yeah.
boring story too if it's like
Sure.
I sat down with my sister and I told her go date Charlene and she did it. The end. It's like
Yeah.
blood money. Like no, that would not be my favorite story
Yeah.
if that was the case. But
Right.
it would be interesting, certainly to your point, to see a potentially more grounded approach that because like the realism we see here and that I keep mentioning is certainly a degree of psychological realism, but when you think about the actual actions that take place, they feel justified. I feel like based on just how the characters think, it's stuff they would do. Is it stuff people should do or would do in real life? I don't know, but he makes it feel like this is something Elizabeth would do, and she would go to these lengths, and she's not above it, and it feels natural for her to give such crazy wedgies. But certainly, I'd be curious if someone were to give a similar story with similar themes and vibes a crack, but trying to find some kind of middle ground there, maybe, or maybe the fact he doesn't go for that middle ground is partly why it stands out. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. It's another very tough thing to pinpoint.
Yeah,
But that's the reason why we have these conversations. It's because stories like this allow us to they give us the room to have these analytical discussions. It's
yeah. Yeah, and I like how open you are about we don't need to have answers to these questions. Like I've joked, like obviously you could bring them on and ask them, and nicely done would be like, oh no, I just I like the two sisters. It was hot. What? And it's like, oh, well, but our great theories about change and flexibility. No, no, it's just it's hot. The back was there. It's part. Of it. But I like this idea. We can just speculate. We can just put more questions forward than answers, which I think is a big part of what needs to happen first to encourage more of that. So I'm glad we can do it.
absolutely. And it'd just be boring if we had all the answers to everything.
Mm, well said.
It helps us engage with stories more when we have something to think about.
Mm-hmm.
So, moving a little bit further into the story, when I got to the continued section of part 5, it struck me how much I was reminded of a manga called Nanatakaru, a romantic BDSM story. The dynamic between Kaoru and Nana have is so similar to Elizabeth and Casey, and I'd highly recommend reading that manga if you have any interest
Okay.
in kinky stuff or just love a great romance story. Yeah,
Interesting. All right. Thanks
yeah,
for the recommendation. I love
yeah,
romance.
yeah. It's
I'm guessing there's no wedgies in it, but I'll make my way through it
well, actually, there is.
nonetheless.
There is.
Now I got to. Now
Yeah,
it's obligatory.
yeah, and it's done in interesting ways.
Interesting.
Basically, it's a sub dom relationship. Kaoru is the male dom, and Nana is the sub, and she stumbles into this interest that she has, and she didn't realize. And Kaoru is kind of like Elizabeth, pushing her along, pushing her boundaries further. Um, it's it's they're both fantastic stories. I love Nana Takaro, so I definitely recommend that one to anybody who's interested in. There are some wedgies in it, but just the further the greater BDSM uh, aspect of sex, I guess, because I would definitely
Yeah.
say that wedgies are something of a very very light BDSM uh, activity, I guess.
Yep. Yeah, it's true.
Something that really stands out to me the further I got into the story is that while Casey and Elizabeth are different characters and they read as such, they feel like one person in a good way. Because by
Mm,
reading into what Nicely Done provides in the way of characterization, I noticed that Casey and Elizabeth are both searching for deeper meaning in life. Casey through
yeah.
intelligence and Elizabeth through carnal exploration. And
Hey, well
it
said.
brings into the question of what do you think are the driving forces behind each character, what they're searching for,
Hmm.
consciously or otherwise?
That's great. I think the core of it is pleasure, but of different sorts. And I also think, step back slightly, that's fundamentally, I believe, what all of us want pleasure and to avoid pain. I'm a hedonist in that way, philosophically. So I think it holds true for the three of them, but certainly different kinds of pleasure. Um, I feel like they're seeking, in Elizabeth's case, there's this power that she wants, control, and she never really gives that up until the very end when she knows her sister Casey is going to be with Charlene. But even then, you have to wonder, like, is she still gonna play a part in their lives? I guess her and Elizabeth, her and Casey are going to go on and I guess remain good sisters after everything that's happened. Guess she'll be like her maid of honor, like all these sort of questions. Like, but they've gone through a lot. And with Casey, I feel like it really is like she has to move beyond books, like move into the real world and gain pleasure from actually living and being a person who's not just in her books and has to experience life, and her sister's helping her do that. Charlene is very similar. I think she's like Casey, just slightly more out in the world. She's really this middle ground, it feels like, between the two characters, and the pleasure she's seeking is the pleasure of figuring out who she is and how to be her own person. We start the story seeing her being at home, and she's like in college already. She has this sort of, it feels like a domineering mother, I think we can assume. So her moving out, having these experiences, finding love, I think that's what the story's kind of all about. It's finding love for another person for the first time. We see that with the sisters kind of discovering sisterly love, but also kind of creepy incestuous love, kind of too, in a way. Um, and obviously Charlene and Casey, and it because you're not sure, for me at least, for a bit, like who's Charlene gonna go with? Is Elizabeth gonna get in there somehow, and what's gonna happen? So I feel like that's a way to maybe sum up motivations. I don't know. What did you think though when you
Hmm.
were reading it?
That's actually I had an entirely different view of Elizabeth. It seemed like
Interesting.
she was only so dominating. That's how she normally is in real life, but
Hmm.
in sexual experiences, she wanted to be the one to give it up. She wanted to give it up,
Hmm.
but there wasn't anything in her environment that allowed for that to happen. Even the person
Yeah.
that she was seeing and then she eventually made up with at the end was
Yeah.
didn't give her that opportunity to do so. And
Nice.
it's stated at one point where Elizabeth is going to the unnamed guy's house
Yeah.
for sex. That's what she's thinking of. She wants him to take her and make her his bitch, essentially.
Yeah.
And so I think
Yeah. That's
it's
great.
she.
It's so
I think she only takes control of these situations with Casey and Charlene in the end because she's the only one who will, and she sees a change that's necessary for Casey.
yeah. I like that. Yeah, yeah, the necessity of it. I feel like generally people who are doms, who are into the domination, they, I think at times probably are like that in real life too, like their jobs or whatever, but I've heard even just anecdotally that there's a need there too at times to be submissive with their partner, and it's kind of interesting to think that they might order their partner to dominate them, like how that works.
Yeah.
There's still that like dom aspect to it, which I find fascinating, and I feel like that feeds into some of what you're pointing out very astutely, that like she has these differing drives, which I think speaks to one of the key elements of the story, which is like it's clear characters aren't just one thing, although they might read like that. And it feels like deliberately because they're presenting to us and they're trying to put on maybe these masks. But we can see through them, it feels like, as readers after a while as we get to know them more. So it's really interesting to hear that perspective you share.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think otherwise I agree with your analysis of the characters. Charlene is a little tougher to figure out because she's not given that much.
Mm,
But
true,
yeah, I think you're
true.
pretty spot on with Casey and Charlene. While I was reading, when I got to part 6, I took a break, and while I was away from it, I had a thought that there's something sinister lurking beneath the surface of this story, and I was almost
Mm.
compelled to find out what it is. I was like this force that was pushing me back to keep going, find out what happens. Like if you squash a bug and you know it's gonna be really gross, but you gotta lift up whatever it is and make sure it's dead. You gotta
Mm,
find out what's really going on. That's
yeah.
kind of the feeling that I had when I got to that part.
Mm-hmm. That's funny. Yeah. It feels gothic in your description of
Yeah.
that too. It feels like yeah, it kind of fits into what I'm talking about. Yeah, it doesn't shy away from like some of these things we don't often see in stories as we noted, but to talk about something slightly different, like the cynicism I mentioned to you, which is a bit of a different perspective. We've seen and we will see after this story ones where there are like Sadistic by Cosby Rerun, another one of my favorites. This very highly intelligent fetishist who's very eloquent, who's driving the action and in control of the situation. And they sort of see things a certain way, and we get that with Elizabeth. But it's also like this really interesting story about light versus darkness and about change. Like Casey and Elizabeth are obviously like white and black, and Charlene is the gray in the middle, and it's no coincidence obviously that the last name is Gray, as quasi philosophers will quickly jump on. Gray is that color in between. It's 50 Shades of Gray. It's this whole idea that it's in the middle, and it's the reason it's always the cliche thing of like, oh, it's nothing's black and white, shades of gray. Like, that's, he's obviously playing on that, where it's like they're not one thing although they might seem like it at first, there's change happening and they fit in this middle ground as they're trying to find out who they are. So I was definitely hooked trying to figure out like what's going to happen. Elizabeth feels very sinister. What's she going to do next to her sister? How's Charlene going to get hurt in the middle of this? Because you know from the very beginning something bad's happened and you want to know what. So it definitely does hook you effectively in some ways.
I hate to strike down your point about the the light versus dark aspect, but Charlene doesn't. Her last name is actually Lorenza. It's not Gray.
Yeah, no, I mean the Casey and Elizabeth, their last
Oh,
name is Gray. Their
oh,
last name is Gray.
oh. Okay,
Charlene is in the middle of this,
okay,
right?
okay.
She's in the middle.
Yeah,
But yeah,
okay.
her last name is Lorenza.
Yeah,
I obviously like as you know, I'm interested in names and etymology. Charlene, interestingly, her name means free thinker, free spirit. So like she's in the middle of this free woman. So she's like you could wonder, was that deliberate? She is this free agent going between the two sisters, the light and the dark. Who's she going to go with? What side is going to affect her? So that is an interesting distinction as well, I think. But yeah, the last name Gray for the two sisters, obviously playing on that whole like morality is gray, light and dark whole thing. Big time, I
yeah,
gotta say.
yeah. And what's happening between them is very gray.
Certainly, yeah.
So something else with part 6. It absolutely blew me away with how true to life it is. Is this passage? It's a little bit of a longer one. Freedom and the feelings that it entails are comedic to me. People have based their entire lives upon that one ideal. that they can be the authors of their own lives and break free from whatever oppresses them into a better tomorrow. Yet, time and time again, freedom has yielded nothing but an emptiness that wallows in the bellies of the newly freed, that it's such ideals of their future lives that are suddenly all theirs. And then they don't know what to do. Without that old enemy chewing at their backs, what are their lives for? How could they possibly celebrate and go about their lives when they carry the burden of past abuse like a happy sling, complaining, yet privately relieved that they have an excuse for being unhappy? Freedom of the body means nothing without freedom of the mind. Do you think this holds
Yeah.
true?
It's such a beautiful point, and I think it's what Elizabeth spends the story trying to shake her sister from, but also like feeding into. Like at the end of the story, her mind is freed, as is her body, by her sister and her actions and her own sort of growing agency and her accepting her feelings for Charlene. So I feel like she realizes by the end, like, this isn't totally accurate. But it's a great question that you ask. Like, is it true that freedom is kind of futile and nothing really changes, which is something that we see explored in a few different perspectives that the characters have. I mean, it's funny that there's something so biblical about this story and some of his other work. It feels like that's something he's interested in, all the angel and demon talk. Even if you think about feeling the fire until it burns, we have this idea of angels and devils, and obviously it starts with someone above another person looking down at them, very like angel above the human or the devil. So I feel like that's something that preoccupies him. And this whole idea of, do we have free will? Do we have freedom? I feel like fits into all of that, because that's the whole idea around God and religion. Is there free will, or is it all predetermined and preordained? I think what nicely done's pointing at here is that things can change, and you're never stuck as one thing. As we see with Casey more than anyone else, she really does shift and fall into the rest of her life. And it's funny that this part that you're quoting is called absence and falling,
Mm-hmm.
which to me feels like falling to hell, maybe, is one thing. The whole angels and devils thing again. And absence of what? Absence of love, maybe, for Casey. Absence of real life perspective on things, which she lacks because she's obviously got this teenage angst that comes at a certain point, especially if you read a lot of books and you think you know everything about life. Um, but it's funny because like she mentions like abuse, for example, in that quote. It's like, is she talking about stuff with her sister, or are there other abuses we don't know about, like with the parents we never see, or is she just speaking like generally and philosophizing about life? But specifically to your question, like probably the final quote is what you're asking about. Freedom of the body means nothing without freedom of the mind. I think it's true, because it goes back to my focus and preoccupation with pleasure. Like, if you're not open in your mind, if you're not accepting of different things and feel free and all that that entails, you will never be free in the body. And that's exactly what happens to Casey. Like, she's so trapped inside of herself that she can't really process everything that's happening until the very end. So it's funny she's like railing against this, but she's like in the same point, like comes to realize everything she says wrong, it feels like, which I think is very amusing.
Yeah, and I think the emptiness in the title of the part is referencing uh, that the characters might be free of their bodily burdens, but mentally they are
Mm,
so stuck and trapped.
yeah, I like that. That's good.
Yeah. So continuing further down the story, part 9 is really where I came to despise Elizabeth. No matter what,
Yeah,
no matter
yeah,
what drove her
yeah.
to attack Charlene or molest Casey. She's despicable in
Yeah,
my eyes, and I don't see how there can
it's
be
true.
any justification good enough for her actions. Can you think of
Yeah.
anything?
No, there's nothing. I mean, she crosses so many lines. Like it's funny to see Charlene develop, more poetic lines like "lust is a stealthy disease," like some great quotes like that. Um, and sometimes he definitely goes overboard, taking whole paragraphs to explain something, but he does it really eloquently, so you're never too bored. It's really directed digressions, which I think are great. But when you think about Elizabeth, all the stuff she does, like how proud she is to be abusive and really brutal, it's like, yo, Elizabeth, you need help. You
Yeah,
need some therapy or something.
yeah,
Like it's a lot. She crosses every line,
yeah.
certainly,
She
and
she
it's what
directly
we were saying.
she
Yeah,
directly
it's
said
what.
she directly
Yeah,
says to
go ahead.
Casey, "I'm gonna fuck you."
Yeah,
Like,
it's
what the
brutal.
fuck?
It's brutal. Like there's no lines. Like
Yeah.
nicely done, doesn't hold back. It's what we said. Like when you look back at it, like you gotta say like, uh, is there any way to justify her actions or to say is this okay? No, I don't think so. I really think she crosses like every line.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a good point you bring up
Yeah.
though. It makes me laugh thinking
Yeah.
about just she goes beyond anything. Like
Hmm.
yeah, doesn't need to go that far, but doesn't stop her.
Yeah. But at the same time, it also cements her in our minds
Yeah,
as a character that stands apart from so many others. This community is flooded
sure.
with all kinds of characters, but Elizabeth sticks out amongst them all because of what she does.
Yeah, that's a great point too. Yeah, we have so many of the tropes, the obvious wedgie girl who's just the classic receiver, and Casey kind of falls into that. Charlene is a sort of like unknowing about wedgies, ignorant sort who falls into them and sort of discovers them. But then Elizabeth is this whole other creature. Like she's obviously the evil giver who's kind of familiar, but then goes beyond every line that we see. And except for really extreme stories, where characters are typically strangers to the person they're giving a wedgie and they'll do extreme things. Like I'm thinking of Bloom 225's story, everyone's pet, where like the character Bloom is getting like raped by these guys pretty much, and it's brutal, with wedgies and a lot of other stuff. Like, but those are strangers to her. It's not like her sister doing this stuff. So,
Hmm.
I mean, it really sets Elizabeth apart, and I think it's one of the reasons the story kind of sticks in my mind because she is so like uh different and crazy in that way. Like she makes an impression that's kind of lasting for better or worse.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty much the way to say it.
Yeah,
um,
better or worse, she leaves an impression.
yes. Now, the words "I'm yours" written on Casey are probably just a distraction so Elizabeth can catch Charlene off guard, but it reads to me as a subliminal message, like Elizabeth is trying to
Mm,
plant the seeds of the idea that it's not Casey who's all for Charlene to do with as she pleases, but Charlene for
mm.
Elizabeth. And
Hey,
Casey does speculate on this a little later on.
yeah, I like that. I think that's true. Feel like there's a lot of stuff there. Maybe Elizabeth is trying to live like vicariously through her sister, and wants to be in on this. You pointed out earlier, it feels like she wants to be dominated. How much does she wish she was either of the other two and wants to be in their position? She ends up not with anybody in the end, I think.
No, she
So
makes up with the guy.
with the guy, she gets the token guy who doesn't even have a name or anything. Good for
Yeah.
her. Maybe she gets Dom, maybe not. It feels like she's getting the short end of the straw. So yeah, that's. I think there's definitely something to what you're saying. I feel like that's a really apt point you're making.
Yeah. And I think Elizabeth is getting her just desserts by getting back with that guy because he cheated on her with just another random whore, as she describes the other woman. Um,
Yeah.
and so I'm almost 100% certain it's going to happen again. And
Yeah.
so I have no sympathy for her, and I wonder how much of that is she's accepting it and she kind of wants it in a way. That instability, that sort of it seems like a different um, aspect of what she was doing to Casey. It's what the guy's doing to her.
Mm, I like it. I like that a lot. Yeah. Maybe she's like punishing herself,
Yeah.
and that's why she's getting with the guy. Yeah, interesting. This is good. I love this.
Yeah, it's yeah. I'm
I
glad.
had a random fan theory that came up earlier from what you were talking. What if they're like Casey and Elizabeth are like the same person, but like a multiple personality situation, like in
What
an anime?
like Fight Club?
Yeah, like Fight Club. There's another example. Yeah, I was thinking of Keijo had had a similar
Mm.
thing, but I think it's a kind of common trope in anime and
Uh-huh.
also in movies. Yeah, it could be like I don't know. I don't know where that just from what you were mentioning before, how they feel like one person. I think is how you described it. They feel like the same. What if they are like one person, just with multiple personalities, and we gotta see who's like gonna take over the body?
Hmm.
It's just a random fan theory I have. I'd have to read and find some evidence to back it up, but I don't. Something I was randomly thinking.
Yeah, that I think you'd be pretty hard pressed to actually find anything to back
Yeah.
it up because of the presence of Charlene.
Yeah, she never makes any point of like this person I'm talking to has multiple personalities, which would kind of give it
Exactly.
away.
Yeah. But it could be that she's just being super graceful and respectful of and just trying to
Yeah,
understand of if that is the case, then she's treating it in a respectful way.
yeah,
It might not be the way she should do it, but by actually playing to the thing in her mind. But
yeah,
that's an interesting
yeah.
theory. But
Maybe
I
we could joke about it. We could look and say, yeah, maybe that's why she calls it blood money because she's getting paid for two students when it's one body or something
yeah
like that. Two people,
yeah.
two, you know.
But yeah, I don't think there's a whole lot that can support that theory. So good luck.
We'll do another episode in a year when I've gotten a 20-page thesis on how they're one person or something. You never know.
Yeah. So I mean, when I step back from the magnificence of the writing and think for a moment, I'm not really sure there's enough characterization for it to make sense that Charlene would react the way she did when confronted by
Yeah.
Elizabeth, almost like she's now a carbon copy of Casey.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if her reaction is the reveal that Charlene is like so many other people who dream of getting out and escaping their predicament to bigger and bigger things, but ultimately become trapped and stay anyway. But I'm not sure there's
Yeah.
enough there to support that.
I could see it. Yeah, it does feel certainly at the end. That's why I mentioned like there's a good argument to be made of like is the ending earned? Does it feel like the characters' arcs are realistic after everything we've seen? Does it feel like that's something that would happen and she would get with Charlene after everything that's gone on, or would she probably seek therapy for what her sister's been doing
Yeah.
to her? Charlene just gets out of there because she doesn't want anything to
Yup.
do with it. That would have been one way to end it. And Charlene's telling this whole story to a therapist, like I really shouldn't have gone there. It's blood money. Like I was not even teaching them, just wedgies 24/7. Um, so I think you're right. I think you bring it up. I've definitely a good argument to be made. It doesn't fully feel realized enough in how it ends and where the characters end up. It's like was what your sister did to you, Casey, enough for you to end very happily with your rest of your life open, free, and all these arcs we've been building towards sort of fulfilled. I personally that's a tough one.
Yeah. And I think if it were to go the way of therapy and talking to therapists and psychiatrists, I think that would definitely drive home way better the idea of blood money.
Yeah,
It kind of feels
definitely.
like the title sort of goes in the same vein as Karate Friends. I don't think there's
Yeah.
it kind of feels like the title loses a lot of its meaning the further on you get.
Yeah, I think you're right.
But it's a fantastic title, so it catches you.
Yes, it certainly does. Because you're like, blood? We don't see much blood in wedgie stories unless they're a horror story, and at which point they're often not very good or very brutal, and people are dying, and you're like, this is not turning me on. Um, and just this idea of money too. Like we can assume like what's gonna happen. Like other stories with kind of similar-ish titles, money in them. We're thinking, oh, someone's gonna pay for wedgies, something like that. And it doesn't happen. So it definitely does hook you. It's an engaging title.
I just looked up the actual meaning of blood money to be sure, and
Yeah.
it does make sense. So for anybody who doesn't know, blood money means any money or compensation paid by an offender or their family group to the family or kin group of the victim. So it does make sense that, yeah, it's she's getting paid for enduring these things, but it she doesn't really endure that much until the end, really.
Yeah, and it's like yeah, she's getting paid. She doesn't need to stay there. Like her mother literally wants her out of there anyway. I mean, she's going against her mother, so that's a cool point. But yeah, I mean, the fact is, it's not like Elizabeth paying her. She doesn't, I guess, really need to put up with Elizabeth and her stuff. But I mean, where are the alternatives is a good question too. Does she
Yeah,
like tell her dad what she's doing? Like, where does that go from there, kind of thing? Yeah, that's the yeah. We mentioned in the beginning. It's like the blood money idea. How fitting is it? What actually is she talking about? It'd be cool, like if she doesn't use the term in the beginning, like you said, and we just have to kind of wonder where it fits and how. But clearly, to her, she feels like this is dirty money. She doesn't want it. Like, she shouldn't be taking it for the things that are happening and the stuff she doesn't know about, but still then stopping things. So, but yeah, it's a bit tricky. It's maybe not like the most natural title, but it's a good one. I like the title.
definitely. I think it would have been a lot better if Charlene had been in Casey's place. I feel like
Mm,
it would have been a lot more applicable because
yeah,
Casey's
you're
the
right.
one who goes through all this shit and yet she's not
Yeah,
paid
yeah.
anything. So,
It's true.
I mean, I guess
Yeah,
that brings into the question because blood money it's not just strictly money, it's some kind of compensation.
yeah.
I wonder if the compensation that Casey gets is being able to have what she wants with
Mm,
Charlene. So maybe
yeah.
that's the blood money for her.
That's could be it. Yeah, it's kind of like Charlene is maybe in some ways the blood money that Casey gets, but she has to suffer and she has to get it through all these wedgies and stuff. She's like the reward that you get after the punishment. In that
Yeah.
way, blood money. So that gives it an interesting meaning and a whole other concept, which I really like.
Mm-hmm.
It's cool you point that out.
Yeah. It actually I just had this thought that I didn't think of before that whenever I when I was visualizing uh Casey experiencing the shit that Elizabeth puts her through,
Mm.
it made me think of I kind of picture the comic Our New Best Friend. Are you familiar with that? It's like super sexual.
I
Um
don't know it. No.
hmm, I'm trying to find it cuz I can't remember who it's by. I know it was on Reddit. It was posted on Reddit a lot,
Yeah.
but so many posts on Reddit, I doubt I'm going to find it that way. Um but it's basically just this uh, new girl at school who is kind of the same kind of thing that happens to her is what
Mm.
happens to Casey,
Okay.
and she's completely opened up to this world of sexuality that she wasn't aware was in her, and just like the way that she's drawn, like the faces she makes and all that. That's kind of what I picture uh, Casey looking like, and once if I can
Yeah,
find it, I'll send it your way.
please do. Sounds
You'll
great.
probably find it a little funny. um, I One of the most fascinating things about feeling the fire until it burns and Blood Money is
Mm.
nicely done's characterization of the driving sexual force as evil or a devil, where it's Elizabeth in
Love
Blood
that.
Money and Sasha in Feeling the Fire Until It Burns. And I think that speaks
Yeah.
so well to the feeling so many of us get from time to time, that this
Yeah.
fetish is something thrust upon us that we don't want and want to remove from
Yep.
ourselves. Um,
Yep.
at the same time, he blends sexual experiences with realizations characters gain about themselves. So, in a way, it
Mm.
feels like he's saying there is only evil to be understood in ourselves.
Whoa. That's heavy. That's deep.
Yeah.
That's deep. That's deep. I love a lot of what you're saying. I think it's so true. I think if we look throughout, and this can be a vast generalization, I'm not a huge fan of those, but I feel this strongly. I feel if you look through the history of wedgie fish literature, you'll see pretty much across the board that driving force that you're talking about, that sexual urge, what anime panties would call libido, and like friend sessions, for example, or what I would mostly just look at just as the fetish and the force that it is, and I love that you call it a force, is generally described as something that is negative, that is bad. Characters who feel compelled by this fetish. And when I was starting to write, I was thinking a lot about this TV series Dexter, and how Dexter, who's a serial killer for anyone who doesn't know, he feels driven by something he calls the dark passenger, this like force inside of him that eventually he feels like is always going to take over and cause him to do things and start driving the vehicle that is him, basically. So I always felt that was a very apt description for how we as fetishists are. We feel at times we can't hold back the fetish and we're driven to do things. Especially those of us with like not the best impulse control as we're growing up, so we may be more manipulative, or just try to move them into conversation or give and get them and things like that. So, and I did that when I was younger, and I've spoken a lot about that. So,
Hmm.
to me, that always rang very true. And I feel like generally it's something, as you point out beautifully, it's something we deal with and we feel as we grow up. Because as I've said, we feel different, we feel isolated, and we kind of can end up hating the fetish because we know it makes us different from everyone else, and not in a really good way. Not in a way like you can
Hmm.
go around saying, I'm a fetishist and I'm proud of it, because
Yeah.
you'd be looked weird by a lot of people. And that taboo is very strong, obviously, although it feels like in some ways it's becoming more acceptable, thankfully. So, to that point, yeah, I feel like Nicely Done definitely plays on that a lot. The thing I might say also is that it's interesting that, as you mentioned, it's layered, this fetish, the sexual drive, and also revelations about the characters, their thoughts. They're kind of separate at times, and Casey will go on monologues about freedom and free will without directly comparing it to wedgies, which is probably the way to do it in some ways, because it might get complicated, or you might really confuse people who are interested in just the wedgies, or don't want the two sort of mixed. Uh, but it's interesting to me to think that the arcs that we see, the positive endings that the characters get, are maybe tied to that drive, tied to the wedgies. So maybe there is hope there too, is the only thing I'd say. Like they end up in good places, they end up together, and that's only because of the wedgies that happened before. So maybe it's not all bad. Maybe there is hope. I feel like that's maybe what Nicely Done is trying to say. But I'm also an optimist and a sentimentalist, so maybe I'm reading too much into it. But I like to think that the fact the wedgies are essential to the story, and the characters' arcs do get realized, even if it's not to the whole degree we'd maybe like, as we said. The fact that characters end up in better places, freer than they were in some cases, and in places that feels like they want to be, because of the wedgies. I feel like there's something to be said that maybe the drive isn't all bad. There's good to it as well, even if it's like an ends justifies the means kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and if you're reading too far into it with your thought, then I absolutely read way too far into it with my thought.
I
But
love
yeah,
how you
that's
broke that down, though. That's wonderful.
yeah, that's those are the those are the things why that's why I like to write these thoughts out so I know
It's
so I can
great.
convey it as eloquently as possible. But yeah, it's
Wonderful.
that does seem. I think it's maybe it's something that a lot of writers try to accomplish, but I think because um nicely done is so eloquent and so well written, his writing is so intelligent, we're actually able to infer this from what he's given us.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no like explicit lines where it's like the fetish is evil and wedgies are bad.
Exactly.
So it is all implied, but just as we can aptly, as you say, and I think very accurately point out that the driving force is defined and described and implied to be negative, sexual urges. There can also be good things that emerge out of it, and I imagine feeling the fire until it burns continued, we'd see them getting together. It feels like that's inevitable. And it's something I feel like always rang very true for me. And I took into basically all my stories without realizing it till years after I'd been writing for a bit. And it's this idea that there is a positive spin that you can put on the fetish, which takes a while for some of us to realize. And I think nicely done. And this story is one of the first ways and instances when I saw that, as subtle as it is. Because when I write like Lucy and Daniela, YWR Teacher Wedge Fight, those stories, the theme I realized was like friendships are formed because of wedgies. And that is like there's a positive here. The characters go through stuff, they break apart, they have fights, the wedgies can hurt. But in the end, because of the wedgies, there's something good that comes out of it. So I feel like that can be tied directly to the stuff Nicely Done was doing and those sort of fascinations he has as a writer in some ways.
Yeah, there's nothing really subtle about it in Blood Money. You,
True.
you just got to read
True.
the ending. They end up very happy, all three of them.
Yeah. Excellent, excellent point. Yes.
And so there's a little bit of, I guess, I don't know what the right word is, but to I guess to bring it away from the praising, I guess, of the story is
Yes,
for a
please.
little bit.
Yeah.
I'm honestly lost as to where
Hmm.
Charlene's attraction to Casey came from. It
Great
seems
question.
like it came out of nowhere, purely for the sake
Yeah.
of the story. And I'm actually pretty
Yeah.
disappointed it happened that way. Like there was so much
Yeah.
buildup for some crazy, insane thing to happen. And then the
Yeah.
most obvious thing happens.
It's true. Yeah. Instead of like diving deep into some of these arcs and drawing out a lot of action, what we have is what feels like a very tight story, and some things certainly it does feel rushed. The entire Casey and Elizabeth relationship is sort of distilled down to, oh, it was all part of my plan to help you get to where you needed to be. And that's good. The end, sort of thing. And same with Charlene and Casey. It's like they get together. It's not a surprise, really, and it's kind of out of nowhere when it happens, but you're not like, oh, that's like a shocker. Like it just happens. You're like, okay, like it feels in a lot of ways again like one of those gothic romancy stories. There are two people in the old giant rich mansion and they're getting together, and it's like, okay, I feel like you're right. There could have been a lot more explored there. Clearly, the characters think very very deeply, sorry, about literally everything that they can
Mm-hmm.
think about. Like they're examining in a very teenage angsty way everything from freedom to philosophy to the nature of existence. So you'd think you'd certainly could have spent more
Yeah.
time diving into what it is about these characters. I mean, we don't get a lot of moments where just the characters are hanging out and it's not very deep examinations of topics that we don't get really casual conversation moments. It's very deep analysis of life or it's very intense sexual wedgies, and there doesn't seem to be much of a middle ground between those. But maybe I'm wrong. Do you feel like that kind of sums up the story a little bit,
Yeah,
or is that too
definitely.
simplistic?
I think that's correct. And in this story, I think it's I'm wouldn't I'm not really I guess I'm happy there really isn't much of the just hanging out
Yeah.
downtime sort of stuff,
Yeah.
because it gives so much more space for the story to be intelligent and
That's fair.
push my analysis. But
Yeah.
yeah, it really like the ending doesn't really feel like an ending to me. It
Yeah.
feels like it's just taking extremely realized and well developed pieces and mashing them into a puzzle that they don't fit
Mm.
into.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess there really it just I think it comes down to the fact that there aren't really any consequences for what happens. Everything
Yeah. Classic.
everything that happens ends up being really good, and it was all part of the plan, and it was a great thing that it happened. Um,
Yeah.
like
So well said.
I wish there had been something like
Yeah.
some kind of falling out between the sisters, or um, one of them talking with an outside entity about what happened to them and
Yeah.
breaking like talking about how negative it really was. 'Cause, yeah, you get good stuff out of it, but I can't imagine that they're just looking past all of the bad shit that happened to
Yeah.
get to there.
It's so well said. It's such a good point. I mean, that was the first trend as I was like seriously looking at wedgie stories that I caught on. It's like there is this great lack of consequences in
Mhm.
wedgie fish fiction as a genre. It's one of our like defining characteristics.
Yeah.
And it's certainly true in this story, as I believe it is in his other works as well. And he's not alone in that. It's certainly like Lucy and Daniela, they have a school-wide wedgie war, and no consequences there, as far as we know. No one gets expelled or anything. So like he's certainly not alone in that. He's in good company in it, but you're definitely left in instances like this where as dark as the story goes, as intense as some of the scenes are, maybe therapy is warranted. Maybe it ends with a character like showing that they've changed and they've maybe written a book with many less wedgies in it about their experience, talking about how they worked through some of the stuff that happened to them. Like maybe Elizabeth is painted as this more straight up abusive character, and Casey's able to get free of her, and there's consequences in that. You know,
Mhm.
like her relationship with her sister is broken, but she does have a good relationship that's probably a bit tainted because of what all the stuff her sister did to her, but she does have a relationship with Charlene. There's a lot of like deep consequences that you could play out that would add realism to the story 100%. But obviously like it's so rare to find super realistic wedgie stories, although as realistic as I call this one and as I call the stories within that sort of school of realism by like Cosby Rerun, Anti-Cherry, obviously it's not hard to look at any of those and say like, yeah, but it's not really realistic. I mean, what they're thinking is, and they capture the perspective of fetishists really well, some of the best to ever do it. But there is across the board this lack of consequences, and it's like it would be so different a story if there were some consequences
Yeah.
somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it speaks to just the quality and the high level of the story that we even want something from that.
Yeah,
Like
certainly. Yeah, we could.
there's
Yeah, it's the
there's
fact we're talking about it and all
exactly.
this. Like,
Yeah, like
we could just be like, it was a hot story.
Yeah, there's so many stories out there that yeah, you read it and you go on your day, but we're actually thinking about
Exactly.
this and we're
Yeah.
analyzing it and we're wanting more. We want it to be better because it's already so good.
Mm.
And I
Well
wonder,
said.
you brought up a little bit of like writing out like consequences, something. I wonder if sadistic had been continued, if there had been, if it would have gone into that to some degree.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I mean, we get these very hot characters and sadistic in Cosby Rerun story, and you have to wonder, like, it feels like almost by the end of that story, the main character is coming up against this like immovable object, and the protagonist is this unstoppable force. So what's gonna happen with all the wedgies the character wants? The character's already kind of burning bridges in the first chapter, giving out wedgies, and you feel like maybe they can get away with it because it feels like, oh, just a little prank. But a story like that, as real as it feels, it would be really interesting to see if there were some consequences. Like, even if they're kind of depressing, like they don't want to hang out with the protagonist anymore. Because every time they do, mysteriously wedgies happen, and they end up
Hmm.
getting wedgies that are really brutal. Uh, you gotta wonder about some of that.
Yeah.
It's a great point, and it's interesting to look at some of those older stories and just speculate like what could some consequences be. Like the obvious is like somebody would get punched in the face. This is almost always the obvious consequence, and nobody gets punched in the face in
Yeah.
stories. Very
Yeah.
rarely.
And not to talk too long on sadistic because we will do an episode on that shortly.
Sure.
But I think the immovable object isn't quite as immovable as it appears.
It's true. She gets some hot
Mhm.
wedgies and kind of
Yeah.
likes it, but yeah,
Yeah.
certainly, yeah.
So now that we've gotten through the ending, what do you think the strengths of this story are of Blood Money?
Wow. That's a good question. I feel like it is the atmosphere, which is not a term we often talk about in Ouija stories, but
Mm.
from the descriptions of the characters to the way they think and the way the perspectives shift and they feel unique, it does create the word I keep spamming, this gothic atmosphere, it feels like, where you have angst plus intense love slash taboo stuff like incest. So it all equals gothic in some ways in my mind.
Hmm.
I think that's one of its great strengths, that you have so clearly this interesting atmosphere, setting, and tone to the story. As well as I do like the characters and the way they think, the fact they think so deeply and intelligently and very eloquently. I think that's excellent. I think I'm gonna gravitate towards that and come back to it for that. I think beyond other stories that might be cool to reread, it's really a story. If you want to think, it's gonna make you do that.
Yeah. Yeah, that is actually a really good point. We don't think about the atmosphere very much, but
No.
it's because this is such a well written story. You're able to even take the time to appreciate that aspect of it. Whereas in so many other
Mm.
stories, probably the majority of stories in the community, there's really no consideration for it whatsoever.
Yeah.
Eh, I'd consider Nicely Done the master of fully capturing scenes, and that skill is on
Mm.
full display here. I consider him the best of all of them.
Mm. Yeah. I'm with you.
And there are plenty of strengths here, but the other one that I really wanted to highlight is the emotions and sensations the characters experience, especially Casey, are so
Yeah.
visceral. I can almost feel them myself as if I were the one experiencing them.
Mm-hmm.
That's so well done.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Hmm.
Yeah. So psychological realism that I keep going on about, like, is done expertly. in this story, and one of the best to do it. This sadistic, like it's within that school that like takes it very seriously. That's like I'm gonna tell you exactly what characters are thinking and feeling, and you're gonna understand it fully. And we're not gonna be done until you fully get every aspect of it. And it obviously lends itself super well to erotica and wedgie fish fiction, where like we want to know, or at least I do as a reader, I want to know what characters are thinking and feeling about the wedgie specifically. Um, and the nice byproduct and side effect is like, do I get to know how they think and feel about everything else? And Nicely Done's like, yes, I will tell you how they think and feel about literally everything. Everything from freedom to these deep topics you're never going to see explored in wedgie stories. I'm going to tell you how they feel about it all. And you're like, whoa, it's really cool.
Yeah, and it's so well done, insanely well done.
Yeah, definitely.
And so, conversely, what do you think the weaknesses are?
Mm. Yeah, I think you very aptly pointed out some of them already. I'll jump on the bandwagon and say, like, I would love to have seen some consequences, would have loved to see some elements of the characters fleshed out more to really show why does Casey get with Charlene? What exactly is it there between them? Would love more in that. I suppose because it feels the pacing is very quick and deliberate. I feel like that's maybe also a slight weakness in that you're like, I really want more. I want to see more of these characters and understand how relationships are developing over a bit longer of a period, or slightly more scenes, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think to really summarize my thought on that whole the ending, really, like I think the last two parts feel kind of weak in comparison to the rest. And
Mm.
this will probably come across as kind of harsh, but it kind of feels like Nicely Done took the art he crafted and pissed on it, or rather ejaculated
Whoa.
on it to give some fetish wording.
Oh.
It feels like he went from writing an insanely awesome, analytical, and high level story to writing porn. That's what it felt
Okay.
like while reading.
Yeah, okay.
Uh,
I understand that. Yes.
yeah.
I know what you mean.
Yeah, there really wasn't anything I could infer from those last parts. It was just kind of porn to
Mm.
skim through once I'd already gotten off. And I basically
Yeah.
saw a complete tonal shift from the rules and conventions of wedgie writing you had before are flipped on their head and thrown
Mm.
away to now,
Yeah.
here's those things you threw away. Sorry about that.
Sorry about that. Wonderful. That's a beautiful description in general. I want that on my tombstone. What you just said.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's very amusing.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think it rings true. Yeah, I see exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
And that's very, very, very apt analysis. Yeah.
And the other thing that I really picked up on was that the three main characters, while they do feel very different from each other, because Nicely Done consistently writes at such a high level of quality, as odd as it is to say, that seems to blend the characters a little. Like there could be more distinction between them in the way they speak or think.
Yeah.
They do
Yeah.
kind of,
I get that.
they seem to think and speak exactly the same as each other.
Yeah.
Um,
It's true.
yeah.
It's true. I was noticing that on the reread. I was like, they are all so intelligent, so eloquent. Why can't somebody be less so?
Yeah, why can't somebody be an idiot?
Uh, why can't somebody be an idiot? But there's like a beauty and intelligence in like
Yes.
being an idiot too,
Yes.
which we don't get in this story. But even like I haven't talked to you, but I love NYPD Blue. I think it's the best cop show and one of the best TV series ever, and has one of the best character arcs in TV history. Period. Um, and these characters, they're cops, so they're not talking like super eloquent. There's even just small dialogue where they're like, oh, I ain't got none of that, or something. It's like this, it feels really real and genuine. It's like, what if there was a bit more of that, and not everyone in Blood Money was trying to write like a really intelligent thesis and poetry and philosophy essay whenever they were speaking. Like, and it's great to see, and I love it, and it's a lot of what I try to do in my stories. But why can't they maybe just talk a bit more like real and down to earth, maybe at times? So I get and it does feel like when they're all talking the same and exploring stuff, and it's like telling us their life stories, but in really like creative, colorful ways. It's like, yeah, I get it. It kind of blends together in some ways, definitely.
Hmm. Yeah. Uh, yeah, that's pretty much exactly my thought process on it. And I think you did discuss with me to some length NYPD Blue
I love
before.
NYP Blue. It makes
Um,
me want to write like a Wedgie cop story, and I was like I was trying to like commission some like detective cop stories that would be procedural. I love NYPD Blue. I love Andy Sipowicz. He's the guy I'm talking about when I say best character arc. Like cross TV, one of the best. He's like probably my favorite all time character development arc. Up
hmm,
there with Walter White, definitely. He's probably number one though. I love him so much.
hmm. I mean, I would say Michael Scott is number one. That's
Michael
my own
Scott is a
preference.
great example. Yeah, you laugh, but it's true. Like
Yeah,
he's an excellent example of character development. Yeah.
yeah. And I could go on and on about The Office all day, but
Yeah.
which of the three is your favorite?
Oh wow, that's tough. It's funny because
Yeah.
just after we mentioned how similar they kind of are, which one is our favorite?
It's all purposeful.
Yeah, it's great. I love it. Probably Charlene because of how in the middle and stuck she is. She gets to come into this odd situation and try to find her place among these very like almost binary sisters who are complete opposites of one another. She's doesn't fit into that kind of familiar trope of the sisters being total opposites, which I like. She's kind of stands on her own, and I think that sets her apart in my mind too. Plus the whole like classic idea of like the tutor coming to the gothic house, like really to me sells the whole gothic element of the story. Where I'm almost wondering if it's gonna be like a turn of the screw thing. Like, are these two girls ghosts or something? Is she seeing ghosts? That would be really gothic. Like, but too bad they're not ghosts. That would be a totally different story too. Or it
No.
will fit into my crazy thesis about them being
Mhm.
one person. Something. Who
Yeah,
knows?
that's why there's another theory that they're just ghosts, like in the movie The Others.
Yeah, exactly. It's the others, which is an adaptation. I'm 90% sure of the turn of the screw, where a school teacher comes to like a house, gothic house or something, and is this person she's teaching a ghost? We don't know. Famous gothic story, the turn of the screw.
Yeah. I actually done. I wasn't aware of that, but it sounds like it might be the case. And
Yeah,
it's a great
I'm
horror movie.
99% sure it's an adaptation of the turn of the screw. But your listeners can check, and then they can fact check me in the comments.
Hmm. Very nice. I honestly, I don't think I have a favorite. I just
Okay.
through discussing with you and reading through the story, I'm drawn to Elizabeth the most because she feels like the most layered character. No, even though
Yeah.
I find her absolutely abhorrent, there's something about her that brings me, that
Yeah.
draws me in and makes me pay attention to her the most. Which makes me
Mm,
it
I
makes
like
me
that.
all the more sad that it's kind of like she's basically dropped entirely from the ending. I mean,
It's true.
she orchestrates this thing, and then what is she just standing back and watching it happen? And then when the guy comes
Yeah.
over, she meets up with him. Like
Yeah.
where is she
Yeah.
during their
Where is she?
yeah what
Yeah.
happened? Where is she during Charlene and Casey's
Yeah.
interaction?
Great question. Yeah. It's a great point. Yeah. Would have been cool to see her. Even if she's like in the closet watching them or something, just giving her sister a thumbs up. Really
Yeah.
creepy. Something really weird like that, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's just how the story ends. It's like, and I was giving my sister a thumbs up as she fell into the rest of her life. It's like,
Uh
that's really weird. Nicely done, but all right.
huh. Yeah. Well, and so now we come to my Witch Earth segment. And so, for anyone who's not aware, when discussing realism in stories, I have a question I like to pose. Out of the four Earths I'm about to describe, which do you believe blood money falls under? Realistic Earth, where Earth is normal as we live it every day. Alternate Earth, where Earth is changed to some degree, mainly focusing on wedgies. Idealistic Earth, where Earth is changed to fit the desires of the wedgie community or some aspect of it, depending on the writer. Or fantastical Earth, where Earth is changed to be unrecognizable, like Lord of the Rings and Dungeons of the Dragons. And it can be a mix of those four, it can change between them, or be none at all and be something entirely different from what I just laid out.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to go first this time? I'm
Yeah,
curious what your
sure.
thoughts are.
I believe this story falls into idealistic Earth. I
Mm.
think it's absolutely beautifully written. Yet I think this fits the best because most people don't think or speak this way.
Yeah.
Maybe to a lesser
Yeah.
degree, but it's like the true geniuses and poets think like that, but not many people
Yeah.
do. And the way the characters react to their experiences feels much more like it came from a fetishist mindset rather than real
Mm.
life.
Yeah. Well said.
So, what do you think?
Yeah, no, as usual, my brother, we're on the same page.
Okay.
I've also idealistic, definitely.
Yeah.
For all the points you mentioned, plus everything from like the lack of consequences to the fact it's wrapped up so neatly in a bow when there are
Yes.
questions around like wouldn't Casey be kind of traumatized by everything that happened and why exactly are these characters together when we haven't gotten a lot to back that up and set it up. Idealistic, definitely, because it's a very idealistic ending and a very
Hmm.
idealistic in that wedgies do bring people together, a theme that fascinates me and can be tracked back to the story, but realistically, it was I don't think it would work out like that if we had tried what Elizabeth had tried.
Yeah, we'd probably go to jail.
Probably go to jail. Yeah,
Yeah.
probably.
Well, after going through all of these points and discussing the story at length, what about Blood Money has stuck with you for so long?
The ending, all the way the ending. I love, love, love that final line. And it's funny, like looking back through it, it's this whole idea that he would leave those cool quotes, like in italics. Quotes, I just mean cool lines that feel quotable and feel interesting. But I love, love, love that final, final line in Blood Money when the story ends. He wraps everything up. As wrapped up as it is, as problematic as sort of the endings are, but just the final words and fell into the rest of my life. I just love that sentiment. Like falling is obviously a theme throughout the story. Obviously, we have questions, and he sort of acknowledges that there, where he's like, "There's more to their story. You're not gonna see it," which is pretty much what I do in like Lucy and Daniela and some of my other stories as well. But I think it's just a beautiful kind of final line and a really cool sentiment, especially as you set it up. Like you imagine her falling onto the bed, this really significant moment. So I always, always loved that ending.
Yeah. And I think I'd like to give a little bit of a reading of that ending of the last couple of lines. Finally, my body just stopped, and a giant wave of relief and exhaustion splashed over me. But she was there, cradling my head, kissing, sharing. I tasted myself, and it made me burn for a second before I felt so safe in her arms. She helped me into the bed, and we laid down beside each other, just staring into each other's eyes. Smiles fell across our lips before we kissed again. It was different this time. This time, we knew that we had each other, that this was the best that we had ever had and would probably ever have. Our arms embraced each other, and I smelled her hair as we hugged. So sweet. I wanted nothing more. We didn't say a word as we cuddled. Our naked bodies clamped against each other. We fell asleep in bliss. This was the beginning of something. A car door slamming and a guy's voice apologizing snapped me out of my tender sleep. Before I knew it, two pairs of loud footsteps sprinted up the stairs, and Elizabeth's door slammed harshly. It had to be hers, because before I knew it, I heard the same moans of pleasure that had come from me echoing down the hall. The bed creaked as she forgave him. Looks like Elizabeth rekindled that fire pretty quickly. And I had my own fire, resting in my arms. Peace was over Casey's face, and I kissed her slightly sweaty head and closed my eyes and fell into the rest of my life.
Gives me chills. Love that ending.
Yeah, it
So
is really
beautiful.
nice.
It's poetry. It's poetry
Yes,
is
it
what it
is.
is. That's crazy.
It's just unfortunate that it doesn't quite line up with the rest of the
Yeah.
story.
Absolutely right. Absolutely fair. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But
Yes.
yes, it's so poetic, so well written. It,
Mm-hmm.
it's entirely rather than there's some falling that's brought about before that's very physical, but this is very metaphorical. Um,
Yes.
it's just such an intelligent way to describe their feelings.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. Yeah. Now, this is not a story that has stuck with me, really. It's not one I normally think about, but going through it, it will in the future. So I guess I don't really have an answer for that. It hasn't stuck with me, so. But it's definitely, I absolutely understand how you feel about it now. It's definitely one of the best.
Hey, I'm glad you think so. Yeah. Obviously
Yeah,
not without its flaws, as we
right.
pointed out, but certainly one that's stuck with me, and I hope everybody gives it a shot.
Yeah.
Nicely done. You can write a sequel. Blood Money 2, more Blood Money. That
Yeah,
would
where
be
they go
excellent.
into the trauma, actually.
Yeah,
Uh,
they're all in therapy and they're all talking to a therapist.
Elizabeth is in
Yeah.
jail.
Elizabeth's in jail. That'll be the sequel. Blood Money
Yeah.
2. Elizabeth's in jail. Yeah, and she's probably
Uh,
like. Turns out it was all part of her plan to to fix some convict who's like can't get over their own
oh,
sexual
Jesus
desires.
Christ.
You know, it's crazy. She's the Mary Sue 5 steps
Uh-huh.
ahead kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'd read that. I'd read that
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. It doesn't quite crack my top five, but it's definitely it's one of the best.
Nice.
Is there anything else that you'd like to discuss relating to blood money or otherwise?
No, I think we really hit on a lot there and very astute observations you make as always. I'm just glad to be on and get to chat about stories. I say it every episode, but I want people to be reading more, talking more about these. And I really hope people enjoy this and they go check out Nicely Done, read all their stories on Lucky Fish forums, go subscribe to their art on DeviantArt. They really are wonderful too as a creator.
Yes. Yes. Very humble and just some of the best. It,
Definitely.
I my opinion is that Nicely Done is the best writer in this community.
Yeah, he's up there.
Just-
Top three, top two, easy.
I'm
One of the best of all time.
I mean,
He used to write more.
My Mount Rushmore of writers is Nicely Done, Anthony Cherry, Hans Gutherson, and Saseda. But Nicely
Hey.
Done comes first in that list for a reason.
Yeah, that's fair. He is amazing.
Yes,
He's
and
really amazing.
this is the writing that I like to read. It is the same reason why I've finally realized that 1984 is my favorite book of all time because it's
Interesting.
so insanely intelligent. There's so much to analyze and break down in it. And it's the same way with Nicely Done's work. That is what I'm looking for with reading. I want
Yeah,
to think. I want to be challenged. I want to read something intelligent. It's the
yeah,
best. It is the best. We actually
absolutely. And I'm glad that
it's,
applies to Wedgie stories too. That's
yes.
great.
Yes.
Awesome.
Nicely really if I were to simplify it uh to a kind of an unfair degree, I guess, because it would leave out so much. I think really why I had why the reason I have the idea of uh, wedgie stories being able to be best-selling novels, and like right on that level of quality, and why I believe my evolving idea of the Renaissance, um, which I don't really consider it the Renaissance anymore. My idea has changed for it, but why I think that idea came about is because of Nicely Done, and then to a one step below Anti Cherry as well.
Yeah, that's totally fair, and it's the especially what you know about novels and book quality stories and stories that make you think. That for me is same thing. Came from Nicely Done. It's the reason it's done is not just random. It comes from a person, and that person's nicely done. I think that's very significant.
Hmm. Yeah, if I was gonna change Nicely Done's name to something that better fits what he's done, it would be insanely well done.
Insanely well done. Beautiful.
Yeah.
That's a great
Um,
name.
but that would take away the three. So, oh well.
You get 3 words though, so still works.
That's true. That's true. Um,
Yeah.
all right. Do you have anything that you'd like to promote?
No, no. I want to promote other new writers who are coming up. Read more. Read all of Nufatora stuff if you still haven't. Things by my friends like Shadow Melder, Chaos Recon, other guests who've been on this podcast. Go check out them. And go find some new writers. There's so many new ones out there. Go find a new writer and then let me know who's new and who's popping. I want to know about them too.
Yeah, there's got to be some classics that we're missing just because of the sheer amount
Always.
and they're the fact that we can't really track content very well. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, when I ask like, is there anything you'd like to promote? I don't just mean about yourself. If there's other stories or writers you'd like to spotlight or content creators, absolutely, that also counts as promotion.
For sure.
Um, well, all right, and so ends another phenomenal discussion with Hans Gutherson. Thank you so much for coming on.
Always glad to be here. Hope I can come back.
You'll be back next week, probably.
Woohoo!
Yeah,
Amazing.
keep coming back as long as you want to.
Amazing.
If there are any topics, stories, ideas, etc., that you'd like to hear me discuss, or if you'd like to come on for an episode, if for whatever reason you're just tired of hearing Hans talk and you'd rather hear someone else, or you'd like to talk about a story, let me know. Leave a comment or send me a message on DeviantArt or Lucky Fetish as New Fatora. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of the Best Book Club.